The historical trajectory of the Jewish presence in Sicily is fundamentally rooted in its unique positioning as a central Mediterranean nexus, where three distinct civilizational spheres, the Greek East, the Latin West, and the Semitic South, interacted for over a millennium. Long before the 1492 Mandate, the island functioned as a maritime and commercial bridge, necessitated by the fragmentation of the Western Roman administrative apparatus and the subsequent rise of the Byzantine Empire. Archaeological evidence from the early centuries of the Common Era, including epigraphic findings in catacombs at Syracuse and Acrae, confirms the existence of organized Jewish communities that predated the arrival of both Germanic and Islamic forces. These early settlements were characterized by a high degree of linguistic and professional adaptation, with residents operating within the Hellenistic cultural framework while maintaining distinct liturgical and communal structures. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The demographic stability of the island was predicated on its complex layering of migrations. Following the Vandal and Ostrogothic occupations, the Byzantine reconquest under Belisarius reintegrated Sicily into the Eastern Roman legal sphere, introducing a period where Jewish subjects were governed by the Theodosian and Justinian codes. These legal frameworks established a paradox of integration and exclusion, permitting Jewish participation in certain artisanal sectors, specifically the burgeoning silk and indigo trades, while simultaneously imposing fiscal burdens that differentiated them from the Orthodox Christian populace. The economic utility of the Sicilian ports, such as Palermo and Lilybaeum, required the state to tolerate a mobile merchant class that possessed existing connections to the Levant and North Africa. This environmental reality ensured that the Jewish population remained an essential component of the island's fiscal machinery, even as ecclesiastical pressure sought to define the boundaries of religious identity more rigidly. The transition from late antiquity to the early medieval period saw the island's intellectual and commercial networks expand through the introduction of Semitic influences. The arrival of North African traders and scholars facilitated the introduction of new agricultural technologies and irrigation methods, particularly in the cultivation of cotton, henna, and citrus fruits. Jewish landholders and intermediaries played a central role in these innovations, bridging the gap between the indigenous rural labor force and the international markets of the southern Mediterranean. This period of cultural convergence was not merely a byproduct of proximity, but was a structured result of the island's unique political ecology, which prioritized maritime sovereignty and tax revenue over absolute theological uniformity. Unlike the static feudal systems of Northern Europe, the Sicilian model was inherently dynamic, relying on a diverse professional class to maintain the infrastructure of a trans-Mediterranean state. Consequently, by the end of the 8th century, the Jewish communities of Sicily had developed a distinct identity that was neither purely European nor entirely Middle Eastern. They functioned as primary actors in a cultural laboratory where legal precedents, trade routes, and scientific knowledge were continuously exchanged and refined. This foundational era established the deep indigenous integration that would characterize the Sicilian Jewish experience for centuries. The island was a space of shared expertise where the Greek language of the administration, the Latin influence of the Church, and the Semitic networks of the merchants converged to form a singular, multi-layered civilization. This history of convergence provided the structural stability that would survive successive conquests, creating a society whose eventual removal in 1492 would represent the destruction of one of the Mediterranean's most ancient and integrated social fabrics. The administrative consolidation of Sicily under Eastern Roman rule following the 6th century campaigns of Belisarius integrated the island's Jewish communities into a rigid legislative framework defined by the Codex Justinianus. This legal inheritance transitioned the Jewish population from the relative municipal flexibility of the late Roman period into a highly categorized social strata. Under Byzantine law, Judaism was maintained as a religio licita, yet its practitioners were subjected to comprehensive civic disabilities intended to reinforce the primacy of Orthodox Christianity. Jews were formally barred from holding any office in the imperial civil service or the military, a restriction designed to prevent non-Christians from exercising executive or judicial authority over the Christian populace. These prohibitions extended to the legal sphere, where Jewish testimony was rendered inadmissible in court cases involving Orthodox litigants, effectively stripping the community of equal standing in civil disputes. The Byzantine period witnessed the formalization of the Judeca, the urban Jewish quarter that served as the primary unit of demographic and fiscal organization. In major administrative centers such as Syracuse, Palermo, and Catania, the state mandated the concentration of Jewish residents into specific districts, often located near the city's peripheral walls or maritime gates. This spatial segregation was not merely a tool of social isolation, but an essential component of the imperial tax apparatus. By localizing the Jewish population, the Byzantine theme governors could efficiently collect the specialized imposts required of non-Orthodox subjects, including the auri lustralis collatio, a tax on commercial and artisanal activities. Despite these pressures, the Judecas functioned as semi-autonomous administrative hubs, housing the communal institutions necessary for the maintenance of Jewish law, including the proskutia, or prayer hall, and the archives of the local rabbinical leadership. The economic reality of the Byzantine legacy was shaped by the state's drive for fiscal centralization, which utilized Jewish expertise in the specialized maritime and industrial sectors. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the Sicilian silk industry emerged as a critical imperial monopoly, with Jewish weavers and dyers in Palermo providing the technical proficiency required for the production of luxury textiles. This professional specialization granted the community a degree of de facto protection, as their labor was essential for the maintenance of the state's export economy. The imperial chanceries recognized the community's role in the transit of raw materials, specifically indigo and alum, from the Levant, utilizing their established Mediterranean networks to bypass the economic disruptions caused by the burgeoning Arab-Byzantine wars. This pragmatic dependence on Jewish capital and craftsmanship created a structural tension between the state's exclusionary theological goals and its immediate budgetary requirements. Furthermore, the legal status of Sicilian Jews was influenced by the novellae of the later emperors, which sought to regulate internal communal life by prohibiting the construction of new synagogues and restricting the public celebration of Jewish rites. These decrees reflected an escalating ecclesiastical effort to define the boundaries of spiritual purity within the Byzantine theme, categorizing the Jewish presence as an internal theological challenge. However, the geographic distance from Constantinople and the persistent threat of maritime invasion often necessitated a more flexible application of these laws by local strategoi. Consequently, the Byzantine era in Sicily established a precedent of transactional tolerance, where the community's legal existence was sustained by its economic utility to a precarious frontier state. This complex administrative legacy provided the foundation for the organized communal life that would persist until the terminal mandates of the 15th century. The 9th century transition of Sicily from a Byzantine theme to an Islamic emirate, initiated by the Aghlabid landing at Mazara del Vallo in 827, fundamentally dismantled the existing Roman social hierarchy. This protracted military campaign, which concluded with the fall of Taormina in 902, replaced the rigid Orthodox Christian legal framework with the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence. For the Jewish population, this geopolitical rupture represented a pivot from state-sanctioned civic disabilities to the structured status of the dhimma. Under the new administration, the Jewish community was removed from the jurisdiction of the Byzantine codes and reintegrated into a social order that prioritized religious pluralism as a functional component of imperial stability. This shift effectively ended the imperial prohibitions on non-Christian testimony and public religious expression, substituting them with a system based on contract-based protection. The Islamic conquest introduced a definitive fiscal reconfiguration through the implementation of the jizya and the kharaj. The jizya, a graduated poll tax levied on adult non-Muslim males, served as the primary mechanism for secularizing the community's relationship with the state, replacing the arbitrary confiscations of the Byzantine era with a predictable, if burdensome, tax obligation. Simultaneously, the kharaj, a tax on landed property, encouraged the migration of Jewish populations from the coastal administrative enclaves into the agricultural interior. This demographic expansion facilitated the introduction of high-value crops from the Maghreb and the Levant, including sugarcane, saffron, and hard wheat. Jewish intermediaries, leveraging their proficiency in Semitic dialects and their familiarity with Mediterranean maritime law, became the essential agents of this agricultural revolution, managing the logistics of the arrenda-style leases that governed the island's diverse rural estates. The social hierarchy of the Sicilian emirate was defined by a meritocratic professionalization that allowed Jewish professionals to bypass the traditional feudal barriers of the Latin West. The central government in Palermo, which emerged as one of the Mediterranean's premier urban centers, required a multilingual administrative class to manage the complexities of a transcontinental caliphate. Jewish scholars and physicians, possessing mastery of both Arabic and Greek medical traditions, were recruited into the courtly circles of the Kalbid emirs. These individuals functioned as political advisors and fiscal supervisors, overseeing the collection of customs duties at the Diwan, or state office. This integration was not merely a result of tolerance, but was a strategic response to the state's need for neutral administrative agents who could operate across the confessional boundaries of the newly conquered territories. Furthermore, the Saracen conquest altered the internal governance of the Judeca, granting the community the right to establish independent judicial tribunals known as the Beth Din. These courts were empowered to adjudicate civil and familial disputes according to Talmudic law, operating in parallel with the Islamic qadis. The state's recognition of communal self-governance ensured that Jewish religious and social traditions were preserved within a legal environment that favored regional stability over theological containment. This period also saw the rise of the Mustarib culture, Arabic-speaking Jews who adopted the linguistic and scientific modes of the dominant Islamic elite, while maintaining their distinct religious identity. By the mid-10th century, the Jewish community of Sicily had successfully navigated the collapse of the Byzantine order, emerging as a vital, protected, and highly integrated pillar of the island's Islamic society. The dhimmi system in Sicily operated as a codified bilateral agreement that institutionalized the coexistence between the Islamic State and the Jewish population through the lens of the Pact of Umar. This legal doctrine established that the community's safety and property rights were guaranteed by the sovereign in exchange for the recognition of Islamic political supremacy. In practice, this relationship was mediated through the dhimma contract, which transitioned the Jewish minority into a protected class with clearly defined social boundaries. While the state provided immunity from external military aggression and ensured the sanctity of Jewish ritual spaces, it imposed specific sumptuary laws to maintain a visible social hierarchy. These regulations often mandated the use of distinctive clothing or belts known as the zunar, and prohibited the riding of horses or the carrying of weapons by non-Muslim subjects. These restrictions were intended to reflect the theological subordination of the Jewish people of the book, without resorting to the terminal exclusions seen in the later European models. Communal autonomy under the Sicilian emirs was anchored in the principle of judicial pluralism, allowing the Jewish leadership to exercise a high degree of internal sovereignty. The Nagid, or head of the Jewish community, functioned as the primary liaison between the Judeca and the central administration in Palermo, holding executive power over the distribution of the collective jizya tax burden among individual households. This administrative structure ensured that the state received its revenue while the community maintained its own charitable networks, or hekdesh, and educational institutions. Jewish magistrates held exclusive jurisdiction over ritual slaughter, dietary supervision, and inheritance laws, utilizing the halakhic code to resolve disputes that did not involve Muslim parties. This separation of legal spheres meant that the state largely abstained from interfering in the day-to-day cultural life of the community, provided the overarching fiscal obligations and public order were maintained. The fiscal reality of the dhimmi status was further defined by the gala, a specific agricultural surplus tax that supplemented the jizya and kharaj. Because the Islamic administration viewed Jewish landowners and arrendators as vital economic agents, the gala was often negotiated through communal representatives to ensure that rural productivity was not hampered by excessive levies. This fiscal negotiation reinforced the community's status as a specialized taxable asset, creating a symbiotic relationship where the prosperity of the Jewish mercantile elite directly benefited the state's treasury. The absence of a mandatory military service requirement for dhimmis allowed the Jewish population to focus exclusively on industrial and commercial expansion, particularly in the transit of coral, salt, and precious metals across the Mediterranean basin. The immunity granted to Jewish property under this system prevented the arbitrary confiscations that would later characterize the 13th and 14th century Latin reigns. Furthermore, the dhimmi system facilitated the development of a unique intellectual autonomy, as Jewish academies in Sicily became centers for the study of Judeo-Arabic literature and grammar. The state's toleration of Hebrew as a liturgical and scientific language allowed for the cross-pollination of rabbinic tradition with the broader philosophical currents of the Islamic Golden Age. Unlike the Byzantine period, which had sought to suppress Jewish literacy and religious writing, the Sicilian emirs viewed the intellectual output of the Judeca as a sign of imperial prestige. The legal standing of a dhimmi was thus one of conditional membership in the state, a status that provided a robust framework for long-term residency and cultural preservation. This administrative stability would remain the defining characteristic of Sicilian Jewish life until the arrival of the Norman forces, which would once again reconfigure the island's confessional and legal map. The 10th and 11th centuries marked the industrial and intellectual zenith of Sicilian Jewry, characterized by the community's dominance in the island's high-value export sectors and its integration into the scientific networks of the Fatimid Caliphate. This golden age was anchored in the sophisticated management of specialized industries that relied on technical expertise and trans-Mediterranean credit. In urban centers like Palermo, Jewish artisans achieved a near-total monopoly on the production and trade of silk and high-quality dyes, particularly kermes and indigo. The refinement of the silk weaving process, facilitated by the introduction of horizontal looms and advanced spinning techniques from the East, allowed Sicilian textiles to compete with the renowned workshops of Fustat and Tyre. This economic dominance was supported by the funduk system, state-authorized warehouses where Jewish merchants managed the storage and valuation of wholesale commodities, serving as the essential link between the island's producers and the markets of the Maghreb. Maritime trade during this peak was governed by the shirka, or commercial partnership, a legal instrument that allowed Jewish investors to pool capital and distribute the high risks associated with long-distance navigation. The Geniza documents from Cairo reveal the extensive involvement of Sicilian Jewish families in the transit of heavy metals, timber, and grain, utilizing a network of agents stationed in major ports from Al-Mahdiya to Alexandria. This commercial infrastructure was underpinned by a sophisticated system of bills of exchange and letters of credit, which permitted the movement of wealth across confessional boundaries without the physical transfer of bullion. Unlike the coastal enclaves of the previous era, the Jewish mercantile elite of this period operated as a trans-territorial aristocracy, leveraging their familiarity with both the Mediterranean maritime codes and the fiscal regulations of the Sicilian Emirate to maintain market stability during periods of regional instability. Intellectual life in the Sicilian Judeca flourished through the institutionalization of rabbinic scholarship and its synthesis with Greco-Arabic rationalism. The academies of Palermo and Syracuse emerged as primary repositories for scientific and philosophical texts, attracting scholars who contributed to the fields of ophthalmology, pharmacology, and cartography. This period saw the production of groundbreaking Hebrew commentaries that integrated the linguistic precision of Arabic philology with traditional exegesis, reflecting the community's deep bilingualism. Jewish practitioners in the royal hospitals utilized advanced pharmacological knowledge, documenting the properties of Sicilian endemic flora, specifically the medicinal uses of the island's salt pan minerals and volcanic resins. This intellectual vigor was not an isolated phenomenon, but was a direct result of the community's access to the Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, traditions, which prioritized empirical observation and the classification of knowledge. The industrial landscape was further diversified by Jewish involvement in the Torgovie Riadi of the tanning and coral working sectors. The extraction of red coral from the Sicilian shelf was a high-risk, high-reward enterprise managed largely by Jewish syndicates who processed the raw material into finished luxury goods for export to the courts of Northern Europe and the Levant. This specialized production created a permanent class of master craftsmen whose fiscal contributions were so significant that the local administration granted them immunity from the arbitrary labor levies imposed on other segments of the urban population. The wealth generated by these industries financed the construction of elaborate communal structures, including stone-built academies and ornate ritual bathhouses, which solidified the community's physical and social permanence. By the eve of the Norman conquest, Sicilian Jewry had established an economic and intellectual infrastructure that was unparalleled in the central Mediterranean, creating a legacy of prosperity that would serve as the primary fiscal target for the Latin monarchs who followed. The transition from Islamic to Norman rule in Sicily, initiated by the Hauteville conquest in the late 11th century, established a unique political framework characterized by the pragmatic preservation of existing non-Latin administrative structures. Count Roger III, recognizing the precarious nature of his minority rule over a predominantly Muslim and Jewish population, opted for a policy of institutional continuity rather than immediate cultural erasure. This strategic stabilization relied on the retention of the Diwan, the sophisticated fiscal office inherited from the Kalbid emirs, which continued to manage the island's complex taxation and land registry systems. For the Jewish community, the Norman arrival did not result in the sudden imposition of feudal serfdom, but rather a reconfirmation of their specialized status as a vital urban and industrial class. Under the early Norman monarchs, the legal standing of the Jewish population was governed by royal diplomas that protected their communal properties and internal judicial autonomy. Roger the Roi and his successor, Roger II, utilized the platé, or official census records, to formalize the Jewish community's direct subservience to the crown, effectively bypassing the jurisdiction of the newly established Latin bishoprics. This arrangement ensured that Jewish tax revenues, including the continuation of the jizya under the new Latin designation of gafizia, flowed exclusively into the royal treasury. By maintaining the fiscal identity of the Judeca, the Normans secured the necessary liquid capital to finance their military expansions into southern Italy and the North African coast. The crown's reliance on these existing networks prevented the administrative vacuum that typically followed the Latin reconquest of Mediterranean territories. The industrial infrastructure of the island remained largely in Jewish hands, as the Norman elite prioritized the uninterrupted production of high-value commodities. The silk workshops of Palermo, formerly state-sponsored under the emirs, were incorporated into the Ergasterion, the royal manufacturing complex, where Jewish master weavers maintained the technical standards required for the tiraz textiles. The Norman administration further incentivized Jewish participation in the maritime sector by upholding the validity of previous commercial contracts and protecting the Fondue Q warehouses from seizure by incoming Norman barons. This continuity allowed for a seamless transition in the transit of raw materials, ensuring that Sicily's position as a Mediterranean trade hub was preserved despite the change in sovereign power. Furthermore, the Norman court in Palermo adopted a polyglot administrative style that integrated Jewish scholars into the royal bureaucracy. The use of Arabic, Greek, and Latin in official documents required a class of professional scribes and translators, many of whom were drawn from the Jewish intellectual elite. These individuals served as catapans and fiscal auditors, overseeing the transition from the old Semitic land tenure systems to the new Norman feudal grants. Their expertise in the daftar, or Greek-Arabic registers, was indispensable for the state's ability to verify land boundaries and tax obligations. This period of Norman Arabic synthesis demonstrated that the stability of the new kingdom was predicated on the strategic inclusion of the Jewish minority as a neutral, technically proficient, and highly taxable administrative pillar. The formalization of the Jewish population as servi camerae regis, or servants of the king's chamber, represented a pivotal transition in Sicilian jurisprudence that definitively separated the community from the standard feudal hierarchy. This legal doctrine, which matured during the 12th century under the Hauteville dynasty, established that the Jewish minority was the exclusive personal property of the sovereign. Unlike the dhimmi status of the previous era, which was based on a communal religious contract, the status of servi camera was a precise constitutional mechanism that rendered the Jewish people a royal asset, exempt from the jurisdiction of local lords and the burgeoning authority of the Latin Church. This designation was codified within the Assizes of Ariano in 1140, where Roger II institutionalized the principle that the Jewish presence was an intrinsic component of the royal domain, existing solely by the king's will and for his specific fiscal benefit. The Camera, or royal treasury, functioned as the central administrative organ for this relationship, ensuring that every financial transaction and legal dispute involving a Jew was directed toward the monarch's private accounts. By categorizing the community as servants of the chamber, the Norman state created a legal vacuum where the common law of the realm did not apply to Jewish subjects. Instead, they were governed by a specialized ius iudiorum, a body of royal privileges and restrictions that focused on maximizing the crown's ability to extract liquid capital. This arrangement allowed the king to treat Jewish wealth as a financial reservoir, accessible through arbitrary levies and special subsidies known as the donum. While this status necessitated a high degree of fiscal exploitation, it simultaneously provided a robust legal shield. Because the Jews were royal property, any injury committed against them was prosecuted as an assault on the king's own treasury, triggering swift and severe judicial intervention from the royal courts. The institutionalization of this status necessitated the creation of the mastro protomastro, a high-ranking official within the royal bureaucracy tasked with overseeing the assets of the Jewish community across the various Judecas. This official acted as the ultimate arbiter in secular matters, ensuring that the local secresi, the royal tax collectors, did not allow baronial interference in Jewish commerce. The legal fiction of royal servitude effectively neutralized the threat of ecclesiastical courts, which frequently sought to impose tithes or canonical restrictions on non-Christian residents. By asserting total ownership, the Sicilian monarchs prevented the church from siphoning off revenues that the state considered a crown monopoly. This strategic separation ensured that the Jewish community remained a neutral fiscal pillar, untouched by the competing interests of the nobility and the clergy. Furthermore, the status of servi camerae regis was manifested through the issuance of royal protection charters, which Jewish communities carried to verify their exemption from local tolls and municipal duties. These documents transformed the Jewish merchant into a mobile agent of the crown, whose ability to move specie and manage international trade was protected by the full weight of the royal seal. However, this dependency was fundamentally precarious. As property, the Jewish population could be pledged as collateral for royal loans or transferred as a gift to favored institutions, a practice that underscored their total lack of independent civic standing. This period of legislative formalization established the binary reality of Sicilian Jewish life. They were the most protected group on the island, yet their entire existence was a calculated function of the sovereign's budgetary requirements. Consequently, the transition to the Hohenstaufen era would see this concept of royal ownership refined into a sophisticated tool of absolute statecraft. The reign of Frederick II Hohenstaufen, reaching its administrative zenith in the mid-13th century, transformed the Sicilian court into an unprecedented center of intellectual cross-pollination, where Jewish scholars functioned as the essential bridge between Semitic rationalism and the emerging Latin university tradition. This era was defined by the constitutions of Melfi in 1231, a legislative milestone that not only reinforced the absolute royal jurisdiction over the Judeca, but explicitly integrated Jewish intellectuals into the sovereign's drive for empirical knowledge. Frederick II, navigating a permanent ideological conflict with the papacy, utilized Jewish polyglots to bypass the theological constraints of the Church, seeking a secular basis for statecraft rooted in Aristotelian natural philosophy. Unlike the previous Norman administration, which prioritized fiscal continuity through existing Arabic-style registers, the Hohenstaufen state professionalized the role of the Jewish scholar as a specialized functionary tasked with the retrieval and dissemination of ancient Greek and Arabic scientific texts. A primary mechanism of this scholarly conduit was the translation movement centered in Palermo and Naples, where figures like Jacob Anatoli played a pivotal role. Working alongside Christian polymaths like Michael Scott, Anatoly facilitated the rendering of Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle into Hebrew and eventually Latin, a process that provided Western Europe with its first comprehensive access to systematic logic and metaphysics. This collaboration was anchored in the Malmad ha-Talmidim, a work reflecting the synthesis of Maimonidean rationalism with the scientific inquiries of the imperial court. The Jewish elite of this period were not merely passive recipients of knowledge, but were active participants in the Sicilian questions, a series of philosophical inquiries posed by the emperor to scholars across the Mediterranean. This intellectual engagement was predicated on the community's mastery of the Judeo-Arabic linguistic bridge, which permitted the seamless transition of complex ontological and cosmological concepts from the Islamic world to the Latin West. In the fields of medicine and pharmacology, Jewish practitioners at the Hohenstaufen court utilized the Liber continens of Rhazes and the botanical classifications of Dioscorides, often providing the initial translations that would later inform the curriculum of the Salerno Medical School. Frederick II's interest in veterinary science and anatomy, particularly as documented in his ornithological studies, relied on the observational data and translations provided by Jewish aides who possessed access to earlier Arabic biological treatises. This technical utility ensured that the community occupied a unique niche within the royal bureaucracy, functioning as a lay intellectual class that remained largely immune to the ecclesiastical censorship of the mendicant orders. The resulting intellectual flourishing created a climate where Jewish rationalism became a core component of the Sicilian state's prestige, providing the emperor with the scientific authority necessary to assert imperial independence. Furthermore, this period saw the institutionalization of Jewish translation bureaus, which were funded directly by the Camera to produce Hebrew versions of Arabic astrological tables and geometrical treatises. These works were essential for the state's maritime navigation and architectural planning, demonstrating that scholastic cross-pollination was a pragmatic tool of governance. The status of the Jewish scholar as an imperial functionary reached its absolute peak during this era, establishing a legacy of cultural integration that far exceeded the mere transactional protection of earlier centuries. The intellectual infrastructure created under Frederick II ensured that the Sicilian Giudecca remained the most sophisticated center of Jewish learning in southern Europe, serving as the final high water mark of Mediterranean pluralism before the arrival of the more exclusionary Angevin and Aragonese dynasties. The industrial prominence of the Jewish population in Palermo reached a definitive plateau of complexity during the late 13th and 14th centuries, primarily through the institutionalization of the dyeing and textile guilds. Central to this economic dominance was the tintoria, a specialized royal monopoly on the dyeing of fabrics, which the Sicilian crown consistently leased to Jewish syndicates. These artisans possessed exclusive knowledge of chemical mordants and organic pigments, such as the use of alum and madder, which were critical for the coloration of high-value wools and silks. The fiscal relationship between these guilds and the royal treasury was codified through the Guzetta, a specific excise tax levied on every bolt of dyed cloth, providing the monarchy with a predictable and high-velocity stream of revenue. Unlike the agricultural tithes of the feudal interior, the Guzetta was collected at the point of production within the urban Giudecca, making it one of the most liquid assets available to the Sicilian chamber. The mastranze, or Jewish craft guilds, functioned as autonomous economic units that regulated the quality and training within the sericulture sector. Palermo's Jewish silk weavers were responsible for the entire production cycle, from the cultivation of mulberry trees in the urban periphery to the intricate embroidery of ceremonial vestments. This vertical integration was unique to the Jewish quarter, as Christian guilds during this period remained fragmented across different municipal jurisdictions. The royal administration recognized this efficiency by granting the Jewish mastranze the right to elect their own proti, or master craftsmen, who served as technical consultants to the royal mint and the camera. These proti oversaw the standardization of weights and measures, ensuring that the metallic threads used in gold leaf brocades met the imperial fineness requirements. The systemic involvement of Jewish metalworkers in the zecca, or royal mint, further cemented their indispensability to the state finances. These specialists were tasked with the refining of silver and the striking of the Tari and Augustal coins, utilizing metallurgical skills that were preserved as communal trade secrets within specific families. The crown's dependence on these artisans meant that the Jewish guilds were often exempted from the angaria, or forced labor requirements imposed on other city residents, as their constant presence in the workshops was deemed essential for the kingdom's monetary stability. The wealth generated by these industrial monopolies did not merely enrich the guild members, but functioned as a primary tax base for the municipal gabelle, or consumption taxes, which funded the defense of Palermo's maritime fortifications. Furthermore, the Jewish dominance extended into the concheria, or leather-working sector, where master tanners produced the high-grade Cordovan leather required for the export market. This industry was heavily taxed through the gishyah, an additional levy that differentiated Jewish industrial output from that of the Christian artisans. The administrative reports of the 14th century indicate that the Jewish quarters of Palermo and Messina provided up to 1/4 of the total urban revenue for the Sicilian treasury. By the mid-14th century, the professionalization of the Jewish artisan class had created a demographic that was geographically concentrated, yet economically pervasive. Their control over the finishing processes of the island's most profitable exports ensured that the Sicilian treasury remained solvent during periods of harvest failure or maritime blockade. This industrial legacy was a structural necessity for a Mediterranean state that required a constant influx of gold to maintain its standing, establishing the Jewish guilds as the essential engine of the Sicilian urban economy. The enactment of the Liber Augustalis, also known as the Constitutions of Melfi, in 1231, represented the most significant legislative formalization of Jewish status in the medieval Mediterranean, transitioning the community from a reliance on traditional custom to a framework of codified statutory law. This Hohenstaufen legal code, promulgated by Frederick II, established a rigid but functional structure for interfaith coexistence by integrating the Jewish population into the state's overarching Pax Augusta, or imperial peace. For the first time, the legal standing of the Jewish minority was defined through a centralized secular authority that prioritized the maintenance of public order and fiscal stability over local ecclesiastical interference. The code specifically mandated that the Jewish communities of the Judecas were entitled to the equality of defense, meaning they had the right to seek legal recourse in royal courts for injuries against their persons or property, a provision that functionally checked the arbitrary violence of the local nobility. Under the Hohenstaufen statutes, the judicial process was regulated to recognize the validity of Jewish evidence in civil matters, provided it was corroborated according to specific procedural requirements. The code formalized the use of the Jew's oath, allowing Jewish litigants to swear on the Torah in cases involving Christian debtors, a recognition of religious tradition as a binding legal reality within the royal administration. This procedural integration was not an act of religious tolerance, but a pragmatic mechanism to ensure the enforceability of commercial contracts, which formed the bedrock of the state's urban economy. By standardizing these judicial interactions, the Liber Augustalis prevented the legal paralysis that often occurred in other European jurisdictions, where non-Christians were denied standing in secular courts. The fiscal provisions of the 1231 Code explicitly linked the community's legal protection to its economic productivity. The state institutionalized the collection of the Gafesia and the Morphia taxes, while simultaneously protecting Jewish practitioners of credit from the most extreme canonical prohibitions against usury. Frederick II's administration utilized the law to defend Jewish lending activities against the spiritual penalties of the Church, asserting that the regulation of finance was a purely temporal matter under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Crown. This statutory wall between canon law and royal fiscal policy ensured that the Jewish community could continue to provide the liquidity required for the state's massive architectural and military projects. However, the code coexisted with restrictive social measures, such as the requirement for Jews to wear a distinctive yellow badge of cloth, though the monarch frequently issued individual exemptions to those engaged in international trade or royal service. The Hohenstaufen legal framework also addressed the internal administration of the Judeca, empowering the communal elders to enforce internal moral and religious discipline, provided these actions did not conflict with the higher interests of the state. This created a dual-layered jurisdictional system where the community was autonomous in its ritual life but strictly subservient to the imperial bureaucracy in all matters of public law. The code established a specialized class of justices of the Jews who toured the island to hear appeals and ensure that municipal statutes did not violate royal protections. Consequently, the Liber Augustalis provided a stable, predictable, and highly efficient legal environment that sustained Jewish life in Sicily for decades. This functional rigidity allowed the community to survive the escalating religious tensions of the 13th century, serving as the final legislative barrier before the arrival of the more aggressive and conversion-focused Angevin regime. The collapse of the Hohenstaufen dynasty following the Battle of Benevento in 1266 introduced the Angevin administration, which fundamentally reconfigured the relationship between the Sicilian state and the papacy. Under Charles of Anjou, the island's previous policy of transactional pluralism was replaced by a governance model that prioritized the crusading objectives of the Capuchin house. This Angevin interlude marked the first instance where the royal protection of the Giudecca was systematically subordinated to the conversion-focused agendas of the Roman Church. Unlike the earlier Hauteville and Hohenstaufen monarchs, who utilized Jewish specialists to assert sovereign independence, the Angevin rulers functioned as the secular arm of the papacy, granting unprecedented judicial and investigative powers to the mendicant orders, specifically the Dominicans and Franciscans. These orders moved from simple theological debate to state-sanctioned coercion, utilizing the inquisitorial mandate to investigate the private lives of both unconverted Jews and recent converts. The theological pressure of the late 13th century was codified through the introduction of the General Inquisition of Heresy, which for the first time in Sicilian history targeted non-Christians as a source of spiritual contagion. This period witnessed the institutionalization of mandatory sermons, where Jewish communities were legally compelled to attend proselytizing discourses held within their own quarters or in adjacent cathedrals. The Angevin state facilitated this process by providing military escorts for friars who entered the Giudeccas to denounce rabbinic tradition as perfidious. This aggressive proselytism was not merely an ecclesiastical project, but a tool of state centralization intended to achieve a homogeneous Catholic citizenry. By late 1290, this pressure escalated into a massive wave of forced conversions throughout the Kingdom of Sicily and its mainland territories in Apulia, resulting in the creation of the Neophiti, a class of new Christians who remained under permanent inquisitorial surveillance. The fiscal landscape under Charles II of Anjou reflected a shift from regular taxation to the systematic confiscation of communal assets in the name of religious purification. During the campaign of 1290-1294, numerous synagogues in major Sicilian urban centers were forcibly closed and converted into Catholic churches, with their properties and endowments transferred to the mendicant orders. The loss of these religious centers decapitated the internal administrative structure of the algemas, stripping the community of its ability to manage its own judicial and educational affairs. Simultaneously, the state imposed new financial penalties on those who refused baptism, while converts were often subjected to the Jews spolii, where the crown or the church claimed a portion of the convert's estate as a restitution for their previous Jewish existence. This economic strategy aimed to leave the Jewish minority either spiritually absorbed or financially liquidated. Furthermore, the Angevin period introduced the first large-scale demographic displacement within the island's urban fabric. The concentration of Giudeccas was no longer viewed as an administrative convenience, but as a target for cleansing. In many instances, the state withdrew the traditional guards from the Jewish quarters, allowing for localized outbreaks of mob violence that forced residents to seek safety through conversion. This era effectively destroyed the legal wall that Frederick II had built between canon law and royal jurisdiction, making the Jewish presence a matter of ecclesiastical whim. The Angevin interlude thus established the ideological and procedural blueprint for mass-forced conversion that would resurface in the following centuries. ending the period of Mediterranean synthesis and initiating a long trajectory of targeted administrative persecution. The geopolitical revolution, initiated by the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, fundamentally reoriented the island's administrative trajectory, severing its ties with the Capetian Angevin sphere and integrating it into the burgeoning maritime empire of the House of Aragon. This insurrection against the fiscal and theological rigidity of Charles of Anjou was legitimized through the dynastic claim of Peter III of Aragon, who invoked his marriage to Constance, the daughter of the last Hohenstaufen monarch, to assert sovereign rights over Sicily. For the Jewish community, the arrival of the Aragonese forces represented an immediate cessation of the aggressive conversion campaigns that had characterized the preceding decades. The new administration sought to restore the internal stability of the island by reverting to the legislative precedents of the constitutions of Melfi, thereby re-establishing the Jewish population as a direct fiscal asset of the royal chamber. This shift was formalized in the Treaty of Anagni and the subsequent Peace of Caltabellata, which recognized Sicily as an independent kingdom under the cadet branch of the House of Aragon, effectively linking the island's legal and political destiny to the monarchs of the Iberian Peninsula. The Aragonese consolidation of power introduced the office of the viceroy, a centralizing administrative figure who managed the island on behalf of the sovereign in Barcelona. This viceregal system prioritized the maintenance of Mediterranean trade routes, leading to a revitalization of the Jewish commercial networks that had been disrupted by Angevin persecution. Under the early Aragonese monarchs, such as James II and Frederick III, the Jewish aljamas were encouraged to return to their traditional industrial roles, specifically in the refining of gold and the management of the state's indirect taxes. The crown utilized Jewish secretaries and auditors to oversee the collection of maritime duties, or ius portus, at the strategic harbors of Trapani and Messina. This reliance on Jewish expertise in the secretia, the royal tax office, reinforced the community's status as a technically proficient, non-feudal class that served as a buffer between the monarchy and the increasingly restive Sicilian nobility. The geopolitical linkage with Aragon also introduced the Iberian model of communal organization, where Jewish quarters were governed by a centralized body of representatives known as the proti. These officials were held legally accountable by the crown for the community's total tax yield, a system that streamlined the extraction of wealth for the monarchy's continuous wars in Sardinia and the Mediterranean Levant. The Aragonese administration also codified the capitoli, or specific charters of privilege, which protected Jewish maritime transit from the arbitrary tolls imposed by municipal communes. This protectionist policy ensured that the Jewish mercantile elite functioned as the primary agents of specie flow between the island and the Iberian mainland. However, this integration into the Aragonese sphere carried long-term risks, as it made the Sicilian Giudecca susceptible to the legislative trends of the Spanish heartlands. Furthermore, the 14th century Aragonese administration established the Syndicatus, an oversight committee that audited the internal finances of the Jewish quarters to prevent communal insolvency. This period saw the formalization of the Jewish gaiti, or communal leaders, who acted as the primary conduits for royal petitions. The geopolitical shift resulting from the Vespers thus transformed Sicily from a southern outpost of the French nobility into a vital node of the Aragonese Confederation. While the initial Aragonese rule provided a period of recovery from theological coercion, the structural alignment with the Spanish monarchs ensured that any future radical shift in Iberian religious policy would be instantly transmitted across the Mediterranean. This geopolitical architecture established the administrative pipeline through which the terminal exclusionary logic of 1492 would eventually reach the Sicilian frontier. The consolidation of Aragonese authority in the 14th century facilitated the emergence of a Jewish social elite, often categorized as the magnates, who occupied specialized niches within the royal court and the viceregal administration. These individuals, frequently belonging to hereditary lineages in Messina, Syracuse, and Palermo, transcended the standard artisan status of the Judeca to serve as familiares regis, or kings familiars. This designation provided them with personal judicial exemptions and direct access to the sovereign, creating a stratum of intermediaries whose primary utility to the state was their unique combination of scientific expertise, multilingualism, and financial liquidity. Unlike the broader Jewish populace, these magnates operated within the upper echelons of the Sicilian bureaucracy, functioning as the connective tissue between the insular Aragonese administration and the wider Mediterranean world. A primary pillar of this elite's influence was the role of the medicus Hebraeus, or royal physician. Throughout the 14th century, the Aragonese court relied almost exclusively on Jewish doctors who possessed an academic lineage stretching back to the medical schools of the Islamic Maghreb and the translation bureaus of the Hohenstaufen era. These physicians, such as the prominent Gaudio and Medigo families, were often granted the right to own real estate outside the Judeca and were exempted from the sumptuary laws that mandated the wearing of the yellow badge. Their presence at court was not merely clinical. They served as trusted advisors on matters of state health and sanitation, providing the monarchy with a high standard of care that surpassed the superstitious practices prevalent among the local Latin clergy. The state formalized this role through the granting of licentia practicandi, a royal license that acknowledged their superior training in pharmacology and clinical observation. Beyond the medical sphere, these magnates functioned as indispensable diplomatic conduits between the Kingdom of Sicily and the Islamic sultanates of North Africa and Granada. Their command of Judeo-Arabic and various Romance dialects made them the preferred agents for negotiating trade treaties and ransoming captives. Because they maintained kinship networks that spanned the Mediterranean basin, they could provide the viceroy with sensitive geopolitical intelligence regarding the movements of Hafsid or Marinid fleets. This diplomatic utility was often rewarded with the maestria, a title of administrative authority that allowed them to oversee the collection of maritime duties. By serving as neutral brokers in an era of heightened religious conflict, these Jewish families ensured the continued flow of commodities and gold between Sicily and the non-Christian territories of the south. Financially, the rise of the magnates was characterized by their dominance of the gabelotti class, the state-authorized tax farmers who managed the collection of indirect levies on salt, wine, and grain. These families provided the crown with immediate cash advances in exchange for the right to collect municipal revenues over a fixed period. This system made them the primary creditors to the Sicilian treasury, granting them significant leverage during negotiations over communal privileges. Within the aljamas, they functioned as the proti, or governors, centralizing communal power in the hands of a few wealthy dynasties. While this concentration of wealth created internal social friction, it provided the Aragonese state with a stable, reliable administrative elite. This era of the Jewish magnates represented the zenith of individual Jewish influence in Sicily, as these families effectively became the architects of the island's financial and diplomatic stability during the late Middle Ages. The internal governance of the Sicilian Aljama was defined by its status as a universitas, a corporate legal entity capable of collective negotiation with the Aragonese crown. This administrative autonomy was codified through the Capitoli, a series of royal charters that functioned as the constitutional framework for each Giudecca, detailing the community's rights to internal self-regulation. Central to this system was the selection of the proti, a council of 3 to 12 executive officials who managed the fiscal and civil affairs of the Jewish quarter. These proti were held personally accountable by the royal chamber for the collection and delivery of the communal tax quota, an arrangement based on collective liability. This fiscal integration allowed the state to treat the Giudecca as a single taxable unit, simplifying the extraction of revenue while granting the Jewish leadership the authority to distribute the tax burden among individual households based on internal wealth assessments. The executive authority of the proti was supplemented by the gaiti, a traditional administrative title inherited from the Islamic period, which referred to the elder statesmen or religious heads of the community. Together, these officials oversaw the maintenance of the Pinkasim, the official registers that documented communal ordinances, financial disbursements, and the registration of land titles within the Jewish quarter. The Pinkasim served as the primary legal record for the Beth Din, the rabbinical court that exercised summary jurisdiction over marriage, inheritance, and ritual disputes. By recognizing the validity of these internal courts, the Sicilian state allowed the Jewish population to live according to halachic standards, provided that these rulings did not conflict with the superior interests of the mastro protomastro. This high official, appointed by the king, acted as the supreme judge for all Jewish affairs across the island, ensuring that the autonomous actions of local aljamas remained in alignment with viceregal policy. Communal self-governance also encompassed the management of a sophisticated social welfare infrastructure funded through the internal gabel on kosher meat and wine. These revenues supported the Hekdesh, a communal fund that financed the operation of hospitals, almshouses, and primary schools. The Giudecca thus functioned as a self-contained social ecosystem where the maintenance of synagogues and ritual baths was a collective responsibility mandated by royal charter. This level of institutional organization was critical for the community's resilience during periods of municipal friction, as it allowed the Jewish leadership to engage in diplomatic intercession with the royal court. By utilizing the Capitoli to defend their administrative boundaries, the aljamas could effectively check the encroachment of municipal officials who sought to impose local labor levies or unauthorized taxes. Furthermore, the autonomy of the Sicilian aljamas was reinforced by the right to communal excommunication, a tool used to enforce moral and economic discipline. This judicial mechanism was recognized by the state as a legitimate means of maintaining order within the Giudecca, preventing internal civil strife from requiring royal intervention. The administrative sophistication of these self-governing bodies reached its peak in the mid-15th century, creating a resilient institutional framework that managed everything from the regulation of craft prices to the distribution of dowries for the poor. This system of corporate autonomy ensured that Sicilian Jewry remained a distinct and highly organized entity, a structural reality that the Aragonese monarchs would eventually dismantle through the comprehensive exclusionary mandates of the late 15th century. The internal governance of the Sicilian aljama was defined by its status as a universitas, a corporate legal entity capable of collective negotiation with the Aragonese crown. This administrative autonomy was codified through the Capitoli, a series of royal charters that functioned as the constitutional framework for each Giudecca, detailing the community's rights to internal self-regulation. Central to this system was the selection of the Proti, a council of 3 to 12 executive officials who managed the fiscal and civil affairs of the Jewish quarter. These Proti were held personally accountable by the royal chamber for the collection and delivery of the communal tax quota, an arrangement based on collective liability. This fiscal integration allowed the state to treat the Giudecca as a single taxable unit, simplifying the extraction of revenue while granting the Jewish leadership the authority to distribute the tax burden among individual households based on internal wealth assessments. The executive authority of the Proti was supplemented by the Gaiti, a traditional administrative title inherited from the Islamic period, which referred to the elder statesmen or religious heads of the community. Together, these officials oversaw the maintenance of the Pinkasim, the official registers that documented communal ordinances, financial disbursements, and the registration of land titles within the Jewish quarter. The Pinkasim served as the primary legal record for the Beth Din, the rabbinical court that exercised summary jurisdiction over marriage, inheritance, and ritual disputes. By recognizing the validity of these internal courts, the Sicilian state allowed the Jewish population to live according to halachic standards, provided that these rulings did not conflict with the superior interests of the mastro protomastro. This high official, appointed by the king, acted as the supreme judge for all Jewish affairs across the island, ensuring that the autonomous actions of local aljamas remained in alignment with viceregal policy. Communal self-governance also encompassed the management of a sophisticated social welfare infrastructure funded through the internal gabel on kosher meat and wine. These revenues supported the Hekdesh, a communal fund that financed the operation of hospitals, almshouses, and primary schools. The Giudecca thus functioned as a self-contained social ecosystem where the maintenance of synagogues and ritual baths was a collective responsibility mandated by royal charter. This level of institutional organization was critical for the community's resilience during periods of municipal friction, as it allowed the Jewish leadership to engage in diplomatic intercession with the royal court. By utilizing the Capitoli to defend their administrative boundaries, the aljamas could effectively check the encroachment of municipal officials who sought to impose local labor levies or unauthorized taxes. Furthermore, the autonomy of the Sicilian aljamas was reinforced by the right to communal excommunication, a tool used to enforce moral and economic discipline. This judicial mechanism was recognized by the state as a legitimate means of maintaining order within the Judeca, preventing internal civil strife from requiring royal intervention. The administrative sophistication of these self-governing bodies reached its peak in the mid-15th century, creating a resilient institutional framework that managed everything from the regulation of craft prices to the distribution of dowries for the poor. This system of corporate autonomy ensured that Sicilian Jewry remained a distinct and highly organized entity, a structural reality that the Aragonese monarchs would eventually dismantle through the comprehensive exclusionary mandates of the late 15th century. The dynastic union initiated by the 1469 marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella the Firmer of Castile established the structural framework for a centralized modern state that prioritized religious homogeneity as the primary instrument of political consolidation. Although the crowns of Castile and Aragon remained administratively and legally distinct entities, the personal union of the monarchs allowed for the synchronization of high-level policy, specifically regarding the governance of non-Christian minorities. This period marked a definitive departure from the medieval Mediterranean tradition of transactional pluralism, substituting the pragmatic protection of the royal chamber with the ideological goal of absolute unidad de la fe, or unity of the faith. For Sicily, which had been a peripheral possession of the House of Aragon since the 13th century, this centralization meant that the island's internal social contract was no longer subject solely to the local viceregal pragmatism, but was increasingly dictated by the uniform religious mandate of the Spanish heartlands. The Catholic monarchs utilized religious uniformity as a state-building tool to bypass the traditional privileges of the nobility and the municipal senates, which had historically served as the secondary protectors of the Jewish aljamas. By asserting that the spiritual purity of the realm was a non-negotiable sovereign interest, Ferdinand and Isabella established a new tier of royal authority that superseded the existing Capitoli and charters of the Judecas. This centralization was codified through the reorganization of the Royal Council and the professionalization of the bureaucracy, which began to view the Jewish population not as a specialized fiscal asset, but as an obstacle to the total cultural integration of the empire's disparate territories. The institutionalization of this Catholic identity provided the Crown with a superior moral mandate to intervene in regional affairs, effectively transforming the Jewish presence from a legal status of servi camera into a perceived theological liability that threatened the stability of the unified state. The administrative shift under the Union of the Crowns was characterized by the systemic alignment of the Sicilian Secretia with the broader fiscal goals of the Spanish treasury. As the monarchs mobilized the resources of their combined realms for the final military offensive against the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, the economic utility of the Sicilian Jews was increasingly weighed against the political advantages of total religious exclusion. The Crown's strategic move toward Unidad de la Fe provided a singular, unifying purpose for the newly formed confederation, framing the military struggle in Granada and the internal religious purification of the islands as two halves of the same imperial project. This ideological convergence ensured that the Sicilian Giudecca, despite its ancient roots and industrial importance, was subjected to the same intensifying legislative scrutiny that was being applied to the Jewish communities of Castile and Aragon. Furthermore, the Union of the Crowns established a direct administrative pipeline through which the religious zeal of the Castilian court was transmitted to the Sicilian frontier. The appointment of loyal Spanish officials to key viceregal posts in Palermo and Messina ensured that the island's administration remained subservient to the monarch's overarching goal of spiritual homogenization. This period saw the gradual erosion of the local judicial exemptions that had previously allowed Sicilian Jews to operate with a degree of social autonomy. By the late 1470s, the political ecology of Sicily had been fundamentally altered. The island was no longer an independent laboratory of Mediterranean synthesis, but a vital component of a burgeoning global empire whose internal stability was predicated on the absolute exclusion of religious nonconformity. This systemic centralization created the necessary political momentum for the establishment of the Holy Office, setting the irreversible trajectory toward the terminal mandates of 1492. The institutional export of the Spanish Inquisition to Sicily in 1487 established a specialized legal apparatus that moved beyond the traditional episcopal monitoring of the clergy to target the perceived clandestine heresy of the baptized population. This administrative expansion, authorized by the papal bull of Sixtus IV, facilitated the arrival of Spanish-appointed inquisitors, such as Fray Gaspar Juglar, who functioned as direct agents of the Catholic monarchs rather than the local Sicilian bishops. The establishment of the Holy Office in Palermo represented a radical centralization of judicial power, as it introduced a theology of surveillance that bypassed the island's established municipal and baronial protections. Unlike the earlier medieval inquisitions, which were localized and sporadic, the Spanish-style tribunal was a permanent, state-funded machine designed to penetrate the private lives of the neophyte, the class of new Christians who had entered the Catholic fold through earlier waves of mass conversion. The operational logic of these specialized tribunals was predicated on the crime of Judaizing, a term that categorized any persistence of ancestral Semitic customs as a terminal act of treason against both the Church and the Crown. The inquisitors utilized the Edict of Grace, a limited period during which individuals were encouraged to self-denounce in exchange for lighter penance, to construct a massive network of secret intelligence. This process relied on anonymous accusations and the systematic use of familiares, lay agents of the Inquisition who operated within the urban fabric of Messina and Syracuse to monitor dietary habits, the observance of the Sabbath, and the use of Hebrew liturgical fragments. The secrecy of the judicial proceedings, where the accused was denied the identity of their accusers, established an atmosphere of social fragmentation that undermined the historical cohesion of the Sicilian Giudecca. A critical component of the inquisitorial export was the fiscality of heresy, a mechanism where the confiscation of a convict's assets served as the primary funding source for the tribunal's operations. The Royal Chamber and the Holy Office established a joint commission to manage the sequestration of properties, which included workshops, warehouses, and credits held by the neophyte elite. This financial incentive ensured that the prosecution of hidden heresy was a self-sustaining bureaucratic enterprise, creating a direct link between theological purity and the replenishment of the sovereign's treasury. By targeting the wealthiest members of the new Christian class, the Inquisition effectively liquidated the last remaining segment of the Jewish-descended populace that held significant economic leverage. The arrival of the Spanish inquisitors also introduced the auto da fe, a highly choreographed public spectacle of penance and execution designed to reaffirm the absolute authority of the Catholic state. These events, staged in the public plazas of Palermo, served as a visceral warning that even the sacrament of baptism provided no immunity from royal scrutiny if genealogical purity was called into question. The presence of the Holy Office in Sicily signaled that the island was no longer a zone of legal exceptionalism, as the tribunal worked to align the Sicilian social fabric with the rigid confessional standards of the Iberian heartlands. By the late 1480s, the inquisitorial apparatus had successfully established a climate of institutionalized fear, proving to the Crown that the mere conversion of the Jewish population was an insufficient solution to the problem of religious nonconformity. This investigative momentum provided the final ideological justification for the total removal of the unconverted minority, as the Inquisition's reports consistently portrayed the Jewish presence as the primary catalyst for new Christian backsliding. The demographic landscape of 15th century Sicily was increasingly defined by the presence of the neophyte, a class of new Christians whose lineage originated from the mass forced baptisms of the late 13th and early 14th centuries. By the mid-1400s, this group had evolved into a permanent social stratum that occupied a volatile legal space between the traditional Jewish aljamas and the old Christian majority. The neophyte were not a monolithic entity. They comprised wealthy financiers, master artisans, and municipal functionaries who utilized their baptized status to enter professional guilds and public offices from which they had previously been excluded. However, this upward mobility was met with systemic resistance from the old Christian popolo, who viewed the sudden integration of converts as a threat to the established socio-economic order. The resulting tension led to the informal institutionalization of suspicion, where the validity of a neophyte's faith was perpetually weighed against their genealogical origins. Administrative records from Palermo and Syracuse indicate that the Sicilian state struggled to categorize the neophyte within its traditional fiscal framework. Despite their Christian status, many families were still subjected to the morphia, a specialized tax traditionally reserved for Jewish subjects, reflecting a persistent fiscal inertia that refused to recognize the spiritual transition as a secular one. This dual status meant that while neophyte were theoretically entitled to the full protections of canon law, they remained under the direct fiscal gaze of the royal chamber as if they were still servi camera. The Crown's refusal to fully desecularize the neophyte created a precedent where religious identity was treated as a secondary characteristic to ancestral taxability. This administrative ambiguity fueled the perception among the old Christian populace that the neophyte were merely political Christians who maintained clandestine ties to the unconverted Jewish community. The problem of the neophyte was further exacerbated by the geographic concentration of these families, who frequently remained in residences immediately adjacent to the Judaica. This proximity facilitated continued social and commercial interactions with unconverted relatives, leading to accusations of crypto-Judaism and the illicit observance of Semitic dietary laws. Municipal statutes in the late 15th century began to include clauses that restricted the ability of neophyte to serve as witnesses in cases involving old Christians, citing a perceived lack of moral reliability. This legal erosion was supported by the emerging doctrine of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which posited that the infamy of Jewish descent was a biological trait that could not be washed away by the waters of baptism. Consequently, the neophyte found themselves in a state of perpetual legal purgatory, where they were neither fully integrated into the Catholic body politic nor shielded by the corporate privileges of the Jewish algema. By the 1480s, the social friction surrounding the neophyte became a primary justification for the intensifying inquisitorial presence on the island. The Holy Office argued that the continued presence of unconverted Jews acted as a living temptation that encouraged new Christians to revert to their ancestral rites. This theological framing transformed the neophyte from a successful class of integrated professionals into a spiritual emergency that required the state's intervention. The suspicion directed at this group served as the necessary catalyst for the terminal policy of 1492. As the Crown concluded that the only way to ensure the loyalty of the new Christians was to remove the Jewish population entirely. Thus, the neophyte became the unintended architects of the expulsion, as their perceived failure to assimilate provided the ultimate evidence for the impossibility of multi-confessional stability within the burgeoning Spanish Empire. The anti-Jewish massacres of 1391 across the Iberian Peninsula established the foundational legal and demographic crisis that would eventually necessitate the 1492 expulsion from Sicily. This systemic collapse of the medieval interfaith contract began in Seville in June 1391, triggered by the relentless proselytizing of the Archdeacon of Écija, Ferran Martínez. His inflammatory rhetoric against the legal protections of the Jewish aljamas sparked a localized riot that rapidly escalated into a kingdom-wide movement of targeted violence. In Seville alone, the Jewish quarter was decimated, with contemporary records suggesting thousands were murdered, while the survivors were presented with a non-negotiable ultimatum of immediate baptism or execution. This violence was not contained by the Castilian Regency. Rather, it metastasized through the cities of Córdoba and Toledo before spreading into the territories of the Crown of Aragon, reaching Valencia, Barcelona, and the Balearic Islands by the late summer. The primary historical consequence of the 1391 riots was the unprecedented creation of a mass converso class. Unlike the sporadic individual conversions of previous centuries, the events of 1391 forced tens of thousands of Jews into the Catholic Church within a single calendar year. This demographic rupture introduced an entirely new social category into the Spanish and Sicilian administrative lexicon, the new Christian. These individuals, legally recognized as Catholics, were suddenly exempt from the sumptuary laws, special taxes, and professional restrictions that bound the unconverted Jewish population. Consequently, the former Jewish elite utilized their new status to penetrate municipal bureaucracies, the judiciary, and the high nobility, sparking a permanent socio-economic friction with the old Christian population that would persist for a century. The administrative ambiguity of this new class led to the institutionalization of the concept of crypto-Judaism. Because the conversions of 1391 were largely the result of immediate physical duress, the sincerity of the converts' faith was questioned by both the ecclesiastical authorities and the Jewish communities they had left behind. In Hebrew sources, these individuals were termed anusim, or the forced ones, highlighting a persistent internal identity that often diverged from their outward Christian practice. The state began to perceive this ambiguity as a systemic spiritual risk, arguing that the new Christians were maintaining secret domestic synagogues and continuing the practice of ancestral dietary laws under the cover of their new faith. This perception necessitated a shift in royal policy from the management of a religious minority to the policing of a potential fifth column within the body of the Church itself. By the time the House of Aragon consolidated its hold over Sicily in the 15th century, the memory of 1391 functioned as a cautionary administrative tale. The Spanish monarchs viewed the existence of the unconverted Jewish community not merely as a separate legal entity, but as an active obstacle to the complete assimilation of the conversos. The logic of the precedent suggested that as long as the Jewish aljamas remained, the new Christians would never truly abandon their ancestral traditions. This ideological framework transformed the expulsion from a localized economic measure into a necessary act of theological hygiene. The 1391 massacres thus provided the structural justification for the 1492 decree, establishing the belief that religious uniformity could only be achieved through the total excision of the Jewish presence. The legacy of 1391 was the destruction of the medieval social laboratory, substituting a world of transactional tolerance for one of permanent, institutionalized suspicion. The political transition toward the 1492 expulsion was accelerated by the institutional lobbying of Tomás de Torquemada, the Inquisitor General, whose administrative influence transformed the Holy Office into the primary architect of Spanish social policy. By the late 1480s, Torquemada had successfully positioned the Inquisition not merely as a judicial body for the prosecution of heresy, but as a strategic advisory council that dictated the sovereign interests of the crown. His relentless pressure on Ferdinand and Isabella was predicated on the contamination theory, a bureaucratic logic asserting that the spiritual integrity of the neophyte could never be secured as long as the unconverted Jewish population remained within the same geographic and social spheres. To Torquemada, the Jewish presence was a localized source of spiritual corruption that provided new Christians with the physical and intellectual resources to maintain clandestine ancestral rites, thereby nullifying the legal and sacramental efficacy of their baptisms. The administrative mechanism for this lobbying was the Consejo de la Suprema, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, through which Torquemada channeled a constant stream of investigative reports to the royal court. These dossiers systematically documented cases of Judaizing among the baptized elite, framing the proximity of the Jewish algemas as a permanent state of emergency that threatened the stability of the unified Spanish state. Torquemada's logic moved beyond traditional medieval anti-Judaism, substituting theological debate with a modern exclusionary administrative program. He argued that the previous centuries of transactional tolerance, where the Jewish community was protected for its fiscal utility, were a primary cause of the current heretical pravity infecting the empire. This ideological offensive aimed to convince the monarchs that the preservation of the faith was a superior sovereign duty to the preservation of the royal treasury, effectively challenging the long-standing status of the Jews as servi camera regis. Throughout 1491, as the military campaign against Granada reached its conclusion, Torquemada intensified his efforts to link the victory over the Moors with the necessity of an internal religious purge. He presented the total homogenization of the Spanish territories, including Sicily, as the final necessary act of gratitude to the divine for the success of the Reconquista. This lobbying was characterized by a refusal to accept any financial compromises. When Jewish delegations offered substantial subsidies to the crown to maintain their residency rights, Torquemada famously intervened to characterize such transactions as a betrayal of Christ for 30 pieces of silver. By framing the issue as a choice between immediate liquid capital and eternal spiritual security, he forced the monarchs into a binary political position that favored the Inquisition's exclusionary mandate. The final drafting of the Alhambra Decree in early 1492 bore the distinct legislative imprint of Torquemada and his circle of canon lawyers. The document prioritized the Inquisition's findings on the subversion of the new Christians as the primary justification for the total removal of the Jewish minority. Torquemada's lobbying had succeeded in redefining the Jewish presence from an integrated economic pillar into a terminal risk to the state's Catholic identity. This victory of the Holy Office over the traditional administrative pragmatism of the royal chamber ensured that the expulsion would be comprehensive, affecting all Aragonese and Castilian dominions simultaneously. Consequently, the Sicilian Giudecca, despite its distance from the Inquisitor General's headquarters, fell under the shadow of this centralized ideological mandate, marking the triumph of Torquemada's vision for a religiously uniform empire. The capitulation of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada on January 2, 1492, served as the terminal military and ideological catalyst for the expulsion of the Jewish population from all Spanish territories, including the Kingdom of Sicily. The surrender of Muhammad V, known as Boabdil, marked the conclusion of the 10-year Granada War and the final collapse of Islamic sovereignty on the Iberian Peninsula, an event that the Catholic monarchs framed as a definitive sign of divine endorsement for their program of religious homogenization. With the removal of the last external infidel power, the administrative focus of the Spanish state shifted abruptly from military conquest to internal purification. The fall of Granada provided Ferdinand and Isabella with the necessary political capital and spiritual mandate to execute radical social policies that had previously been deferred due to the logistical and financial demands of the protracted siege. The Treaty of Granada, while initially promising religious protections for the remaining Muslim population, established a precedent of sovereign overreach that would quickly be applied to the Jewish aljamas. The victory fundamentally altered the contract of protection that had historically governed the relationship between the crown and its non-Christian subjects. To the Aragonese and Castilian courts, the triumph in Granada was not merely a territorial gain, but a theological vindication that necessitated the removal of all perceived corrupting influences within the body politic. The presence of the Jewish community was henceforth viewed as a spiritual anomaly that prevented the full realization of a purely Catholic empire. Consequently, the cessation of hostilities allowed the monarchs to reallocate the state's investigative and bureaucratic resources, specifically those of the Holy Office, to the final resolution of the Jewish question. The timing of the Granada victory was inextricably linked to the signing of the Alhambra Decree on March 31, 1492. The 3-month interval between the fall of the Nasrid capital and the issuance of the expulsion mandate reflected a deliberate transition from the external Reconquista to an internal Reconquista. The military victory provided the crown with a surge of popular support and the cooperation of the urban popolo, who viewed the expulsion as the logical conclusion to the crusade against non-Christian influences. In Sicily, this victory was celebrated as a triumph of the House of Aragon, reinforcing the island's alignment with the centralizing religious goals of the mainland. The financial burden of the Granada War, which had been partially sustained by Jewish loans and taxes, no longer provided a sufficient justification for their continued residency. The state concluded that the fiscal utility of the Jewish minority had been superseded by the political necessity of absolute religious uniformity. Furthermore, the conquest of Granada allowed the monarchs to unify the disparate administrative threads of their realms under a single, triumphant Catholic identity. This new imperial self-image left no space for the traditional Mediterranean models of coexistence that had characterized the previous centuries of Sicilian and Spanish history. The fall of the Nasrids removed the last geopolitical counterweight that might have encouraged a more moderate approach toward minority groups. With the cross now planted on the towers of the Alhambra, the legal status of the Jew as a protected servant of the royal chamber became an archaic vestige of a fragmented past. The spiritual mandate generated by the 1492 victory thus acted as the final legislative engine, driving the sovereign decision to cleanse the land of any remaining non-Catholic presence, a policy that was immediately transmitted across the sea to the Sicilian Judecas. The formal delivery of the Alhambra Decree to the Sicilian Viceroy, Fernando de Acuña, in June 1492, transformed the distant ideological shift of the Spanish court into an immediate administrative crisis on the island. While the mandate had been signed in the halls of the Alhambra in late March, the logistical delay in its trans-Mediterranean transmission provided a brief, deceptive period of silence before the official proclamation. On July 18, 1492, the edict was publicly read by town criers known as banditori in the major urban centers of Palermo, Messina, and Syracuse, signaling the terminal suspension of all previous royal protections and communal charters. This bando was not a proposal for negotiation, but an irreversible sovereign command that granted the Jewish population a strictly defined window to liquidate their lives, settle their debts, and depart from the kingdom's territories. The legal language of the decree introduced an uncompromising terminology that characterized the continued Jewish presence as a source of permanent spiritual infection and a threat to the stability of the new Christian class. The proclamation mandated that after the expiration of the deadline, any Jew found within the borders of Sicily would be subject to the death penalty and the total confiscation of their property by the royal chamber. To prevent the flight of capital during this transition, the viceregal administration immediately implemented a general sequestration whereby royal officials seized all Jewish account books and commercial ledgers to verify outstanding debts owed to Christian subjects. This measure effectively froze the liquidity of the aljamas, as no asset could be sold or transferred without the explicit authorization of the commissary appointed by the viceroy. A specific and devastating clause of the edict prohibited the export of gold, silver, minted coinage, or other precious metals, restricting the departing families to the transport of non-prohibited commodities or bills of exchange. This restriction forced the Jewish community into a predatory secondary market, where they were compelled to trade high-value real estate and industrial equipment for portable but devalued goods like wool, leather, and grain. The Secretia, or the Royal Tax Office, assumed total control over the gates of the Judecas, recording every inventory of personal property to ensure that the exit taxes and communal debts were satisfied before any individual was granted a cedola, or travel permit. The arrival of the edict also triggered the immediate suspension of the judicial authority of the proti and the rabbinical courts, placing all Jewish legal matters under the summary jurisdiction of special royal delegates. The viceroy, recognizing the potential for total economic collapse, was forced to appoint conservators of Jewish property to manage the chaotic liquidation of assets, an administrative admission that the initial 3-month deadline was insufficient for the complexity of the Sicilian economy. Despite these logistical adjustments, the proclamation remained absolute in its intent, marking the definitive end of the historical legal status of the Jewish minority. The arrival of the parchment in Palermo acted as a bureaucratic scythe, severing the millennial connection between the Jewish people and the Sicilian soil, and initiating a countdown that left no room for appeal or royal mercy. The publication of the expulsion bando in July 1492 triggered an instantaneous systemic economic contraction that paralyzed the credit markets of every major Sicilian municipality. As the realization of the absolute deadline spread, the historical valuation of Jewish-held real estate and fixed assets underwent a catastrophic deflationary spiral as Christian buyers withheld offers in anticipation of total abandonment. This market paralysis was exacerbated by the general sequestration, an administrative freeze that allowed royal commissaries to seal the doors of Jewish warehouses and workshops to ensure that no movable wealth was concealed from the state's final audit. The immediate result was the cessation of all standard commercial transactions, as Jewish artisans and merchants were legally barred from collecting outstanding debts from Christian clients while remaining under extreme judicial pressure to settle their own liabilities to the crown and the church. The resulting fire sale environment forced the Jewish population to engage in desperate bartering, where ancestral family homes and industrial facilities were frequently exchanged for a fraction of their intrinsic worth. Historical tax records from this period indicate instances where substantial stone dwellings in the heart of Palermo or Messina were traded for a single mule or a few meters of coarse cloth, items that were deemed more portable for the impending maritime passage. This massive transfer of wealth was not a free market phenomenon, but a state-sanctioned liquidation where the market value was dictated by the urgency of the flight. The Secrezia further restricted this process by imposing a moratorium on the sale of any property until all communal taxes, including the extinct Gafficia and Guzetta levies, were paid in full for the remainder of the fiscal year. A critical dimension of this financial ruin was the collapse of the letter of exchange system. Because the edict prohibited the export of gold, silver, and coined money, the departing families were forced to rely on Christian bankers and Genoese merchants to provide bills of exchange payable in Naples or the Ottoman East. These financiers, recognizing the total lack of alternative options for the exiles, imposed exorbitant commission rates that often consumed up to 40% of the principal. This predatory arbitrage meant that even the wealthiest Jewish magnates saw their liquid capital decimated before they reached the docks. Furthermore, many Christian debtors utilized the chaos to seek legal injunctions from the viceregal court, arguing that their obligations to Jewish lenders were nullified by the status of the expelled, effectively wiping out the community's primary source of passive income. The industrial infrastructure of the Judecas, once the engine of Sicilian urban revenue, fell into immediate dereliction as tools, looms, and vats were abandoned or seized as vacant goods. The royal chamber appointed specific conservators of Jewish property, whose primary function was not to preserve the value of these assets for the sellers, but to inventory them for the eventual benefit of the royal treasury or favored Christian courtiers. This bureaucratic intervention ensured that the financial ruin was not merely a side effect of the exodus, but a structured component of the state's terminal asset recovery. By late 1492, the internal economy of the Jewish quarters had ceased to exist, replaced by a predatory vacuum where the accumulation of generations was systematically converted into a desperate, devalued fund for survival. The administrative resistance to the expulsion mandate was led by the Consiglio del Regno and the Senate of Palermo, which viewed the impending departure of the Jewish population as a structural catastrophe for the Sicilian state's financial solvency. In a series of formal petitions dispatched to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella between May and July 1492, these local elites articulated a defense of Jewish residency rooted entirely in the concept of utilitas publica, or public utility. They argued that the Jewish community functioned as the nerves and bones of the island's urban economy, providing the specialized labor and liquid capital that the Christian population was either unwilling or unable to replicate. These documents emphasized that the removal of such a large, highly taxable demographic would result in a permanent deficit for the royal treasury. As the donativi, the extraordinary subsidies paid by the aljamas to the crown, represented a critical pillar of the kingdom's defense budget. The Senate of Palermo specifically warned that the loss of Jewish artisans would lead to the immediate dereliction of the city's industrial core, particularly the silk workshops and dyeing vats that generated the bulk of municipal excise revenues. The petitions framed the Jewish presence as a necessary economic ballast that prevented the island from regressing into a purely agrarian feudal backwater dependent solely on grain exports. Local magistrates argued that the departure of Jewish lenders would cause a total freeze in the agricultural credit markets. As the Sicilian peasantry relied on these seasonal loans to purchase seeds and equipment. Without this financial infrastructure, the elites predicted a collapse in the annona, the public food supply, leading to inevitable social unrest and famine among the urban poor. Furthermore, the Sicilian nobility expressed profound concern regarding the vacancy of the trades. They noted that many essential services, from the manufacture of maritime rigging to the refining of metallic ores for the royal mint, were monopolies held by Jewish families. The petitions suggested that the sudden extraction of this technical expertise would leave the Sicilian fortifications vulnerable and the naval fleets unable to maintain their operational readiness against the expanding Ottoman threat. This pragmatic lobbying was an attempt to invoke the traditional Hohenstaufen model of governance, where the sovereign's duty to maintain the health of the realm was viewed as superior to ecclesiastical demands for religious homogeneity. The Sicilian elites were essentially arguing for a continuation of the transactional protection that had defined the island's history since the Norman conquest. However, these appeals were met with a rigid ideological refusal from the Spanish monarchs, who responded by asserting that the purity of the faith outweighed any potential for financial ruin. The Crown characterized the petitions as being short-sighted and prioritizing temporal wealth over the eternal salvation of the kingdom. Ferdinand's replies to the Sicilian viceroy made it clear that the fiscal arguments of the Senate were secondary to the inquisitorial mandate of Torquemada. This rejection signaled a definitive shift in the power dynamic between the Sicilian periphery and the Spanish center. The local elite's ability to influence royal policy through economic pragmatism had been completely neutralized by the new imperial logic of absolute religious uniformity. The failure of these petitions marked the final collapse of the medieval Sicilian political compromise, leaving the island's administrative class to oversee the liquidation of an economy they themselves had declared indispensable. The proclamation of the expulsion decree in July 1492 inaugurated a temporal regime of absolute urgency, dictating a 90-day window for the total liquidation of the Jewish presence in Sicily. This countdown, characterized by the suspension of standard judicial delays and the imposition of summary royal oversight, was managed through the Vicaria, the central administrative office of the viceroy. The state utilized the banditory to repeatedly announce the non-negotiable nature of the deadline in every public square, ensuring that the legal status of the Jewish community would expire definitively by the fall. This time frame was not merely a logistical guideline, but a sharp legislative instrument designed to force an immediate and disadvantageous settlement of all outstanding communal and private obligations. The Crown's refusal to allow for a gradual withdrawal was a calculated move to prevent the Jewish leadership from organizing a more coherent resistance or seeking external diplomatic intervention. The primary administrative focus during this 3-month interval was the Regia Secretia, which established specialized auditing commissions to prevent the unauthorized flight of capital. Every Jewish household was subjected to a taxa pro egressu, or exit tax, which had to be satisfied before any documentation for departure could be issued. The state required a rigorous cross-referencing of communal registers against the claims of Christian creditors, creating a bottleneck that prevented many families from finalizing their sales. Because the state prioritized the satisfaction of Christian debts over the recovery of Jewish credits. Many assets were legally frozen in a state of elis pendens, or pending litigation, which effectively stripped the owners of their bargaining power as the clock approached its terminal hour. This legal paralysis ensured that the Christian majority could acquire Jewish properties through the right of preemption at prices fixed by royal appraisers. To regulate the mass movement toward the ports of Palermo, Trapani, and Messina, the vice-regal government introduced the mandatory cedola di transito. This document served as both an exit visa and a receipt of fiscal clearance, certifying that the bearer had settled all municipal gabels and had not attempted to conceal prohibited metals. The issuance of these permits was delegated to conservatori, royal officials who possessed the authority to inspect all personal luggage and cargo. This bureaucratic filter ensured that the state could extract the maximum possible revenue from the departing population while maintaining a precise census of the exodus. The rigid nature of the countdown meant that any individual unable to obtain a cedola by the deadline faced the immediate threat of enslavement or summary execution as a relapsed resident. As the initial October deadline approached, the sheer complexity of the Sicilian credit network and the lack of available shipping vessels necessitated a tactical extension into January 1493. However, this postponement did not signify a softening of royal policy. Rather, it was a pragmatic adjustment to ensure the total recovery of debts owed to the Crown and the Church. During this final phase of the countdown, the state authorized the general inquisition of assets, allowing royal agents to seize any unsold Jewish property as bona vacantia or abandoned goods. This final administrative act ensured that by the arrival of the ultimate departure date, the Jewish quarters had been systematically emptied of their economic value, leaving only the shell of the former aljamas to be reallocated by the vice-regal court. The transfer of Jewish real estate and communal infrastructure during the final months of 1492 was characterized by a systemic devaluation that prioritized the rapid redistribution of urban property over the equitable settlement of assets. This process was managed by the Conservatori di Beni di Ebrei, a specialized commission of royal officials who oversaw the transition of Jewish homes, warehouses, and industrial workshops into Christian hands. Under the legal principle of pretio vilissimo, or extremely low price, assets that had been accumulated over centuries were appraised at a fraction of their intrinsic worth, often to satisfy immediate communal tax obligations or to provide the departing families with the bare minimum of liquid funds for transit. The estimatori, or official appraisers, frequently colluded with local municipal elites to ensure that the jus preemptionis, the right of first refusal, was exercised by Christian neighbors and the Catholic Church at non-competitive rates. The liquidation of communal infrastructure was particularly absolute, as the Crown viewed synagogues, hospitals, and ritual baths as bona vacantia, or vacant goods, once the aljama's legal status was revoked. In cities like Palermo and Syracuse, the mesquite, the traditional term for synagogues in Sicilian administrative records, were systematically appraised for their structural materials and land value alone, ignoring their historical and religious significance. Many of these buildings were transferred directly to the diocese or to various mendicant orders, who converted them into churches or charitable monti di pietà, following a ritual purification. The Hekdesh funds, which had supported a network of Jewish hospitals and almshouses, were confiscated to settle the last third of the royal subsidies, effectively stripping the poor and elderly of any remaining communal protection before the Exodus. Jewish cemeteries represented another category of assets subject to predatory liquidation. Because these lands were located on the urban periphery and held significant value for agricultural or horticultural development, municipal jurati, magistrates, often sought to claim them as public property. In some instances, the Jewish communities were forced to pay a desecration tax to prevent the immediate plowing of ancestral graves, essentially buying a few years of peace for their dead with the meager proceeds from the sale of their living homes. The deeds of sale from this period, preserved in the Notae de Judae archives, reveal a pattern where multi-story stone residences in the heart of the Casaro were exchanged for sums that barely covered the taxa de salida, the exit levy imposed by the vice-regal court. This massive transfer of wealth resulted in a permanent remapping of the Sicilian urban topography. The Giudecas, once thriving centers of industrial production, were hollowed out as the workshops of tanners, dyers, and metalworkers were sold off and often left derelict as the new owners lacked the technical expertise to operate them. The royal treasury facilitated this by granting royal favor to Christian courtiers, allowing them to acquire high-value Jewish assets through deferred payments that the crown eventually canceled as a reward for loyalty. By the time the final ships were prepared for boarding, the Jewish minority had been legally and physically separated from their fixed capital, ensuring that they departed Sicily not as a mercantile class, but as a demographic that had been systematically stripped of its economic foundation. The embarkation at the port of Messina during the winter of 1492-1493 served as the logistical climax of the expulsion, concentrating thousands of displaced persons into a narrow maritime corridor under the supervision of the vice-regal fleet. As the primary Mediterranean node for deep-water transit, Messina became the site where the administrative theories of the Alhambra Decree met the physical realities of mass maritime transport. Shipmasters from the maritime republics of Genoa, Venice, and Ragusa dominated the transport market, negotiating lucrative contracts with the Aljama leadership that frequently prioritized the volume of passengers over the structural integrity of the vessels. These nolus, or freightage agreements, were often paid in advance using the devalued proceeds from the liquidation of Jewish real estate. Yet, they provided no guarantee of safety or even basic sanitary provisions once the anchors were raised. The Conservatori di Beni di Ebrei, and the port's customs officials conducted exhaustive physical inspections on the docks, searching the linings of garments and the interiors of household chests to ensure that no prohibited bullion was being smuggled out of the kingdom. This process of search and seizure continued until the final moment of boarding, as the state sought to recover every possible grain of gold before the servi camerae were stripped of their protected status. The overcrowding on the galleys and caracha reached unprecedented levels, with many captains packing the holds with twice the number of passengers specified in the original manifests. The lack of adequate ventilation, combined with the extreme scarcity of fresh water and salted rations, initiated immediate outbreaks of typhus and dysentery among the refugees, turning the ships into mobile zones of contagion before they had even cleared the Faro of Messina. The technical condition of many vessels utilized for the exodus was categorized as unseaworthy by contemporary maritime observers. Aging merchantmen and smaller auxiliary craft, which were never intended for trans-Mediterranean winter voyages, were pressed into service to meet the Crown's rigid January deadline. The high center of gravity caused by the excessive weight of hundreds of passengers on the upper decks made these ships susceptible to capsizing in the volatile currents of the Ionian Sea. Furthermore, the Genoese and Venetian captains often demanded additional security payments at sea, threatening to maroon passengers on uninhabited islands or deliver them to slave markets in North Africa if their last portable goods were not surrendered. The port authorities in Messina maintained a strict sanitary cordon to prevent the mounting desperation and disease on the docks from infiltrating the city's Christian population. This effectively trapped the Jewish community in a state of legal and physical limbo on the piers, where they were no longer residents of Sicily but had not yet become subjects of any foreign power. By the time the final flotilla departed in mid-January, the Sicilian ports had overseen one of the largest and most concentrated demographic shifts in the history of the island. The embarkation at Messina marked the final physical rupture of the millennium-old Jewish presence. As the last groups of exiles were ferried out to the deep-water vessels, leaving the harbor to return to its standard mercantile operations under a newly homogenized Catholic administration. The maritime dispersal following the 1493 departure from Sicilian ports redirected thousands of exiles toward the southern and eastern Mediterranean, fundamentally reconfiguring the demographic map of the Sephardic world. The primary southern route terminated in the Maghreb, specifically within the Hafsid Sultanate centered in Tunis and the Zayanid territories of Tlemcen. In these North African ports, the refugees underwent a legal transformation, transitioning from the revoked protections of the Spanish crown to the status of dhimmis under Islamic law. While the initial arrival was marked by high mortality rates due to the plague and famine that ravaged the coastal regions of Tunis in late 1493, the survivors established distinct Sicilian quarters. These communities maintained their own religious infrastructure, separate from the indigenous Toshavim and the later Grana merchants from Livorno, often retaining the use of Judeo-Arabic dialects that had been suppressed during the final decades of Aragonese rule. In the eastern Mediterranean, the most significant geopolitical destination was the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II issued a formal invitation to the displaced populations of the Spanish dominions. This invitation was a calculated act of statecraft, intended to harness the technical and commercial expertise of the Sicilian industrial class, particularly in silk production and metallurgy, to strengthen the Ottoman urban economy. The refugees were integrated into the Mila system, a decentralized administrative framework that granted religious minorities significant internal autonomy in exchange for the Sicily tax. Unlike the restrictive environment of the Sicilian Judecas, the Ottoman Kanun name, secular law, provided the exiles with the right to settle in major administrative centers such as Istanbul, Salonika, and Edirne, where they were viewed as a vital urban asset against the decentralized power of the local Balkan nobility. The concentration of Sicilian exiles in Salonika was so profound that it led to the establishment of the Kahal Sicilia, an autonomous congregational unit that preserved the specific liturgical rites and judicial traditions of the island for over 4 centuries. These Sicilian synagogues functioned as the primary social and legal anchors for the diaspora, ensuring that the communal identity survived despite the geographical distance from the original aljamas. The industrial techniques perfected in Palermo and Messina, such as the refining of specific metallic alloys and the cultivation of certain textile dyes, were transplanted to the Ottoman Levant, contributing to the rise of Salonika as a global center for wool and silk manufacturing. By the early 16th century, the Sicilian diaspora had effectively become a transnational mercantile network, facilitating trade between the Ottoman East and the ports of the central Mediterranean. Furthermore, the roots of the diaspora extended into the Levant, with smaller groups settling in the Galilee and Jerusalem, contributing to the safe circle of intellectual and mystical flourishing. This eastern migration represented a definitive shift in the center of gravity for Sicilian Jewish life, moving from the peripheries of Latin Europe to the core of the Islamic world. The Ottoman administration utilized these refugees as conduits of technology, leveraging their knowledge of Western maritime navigation and financial instruments to compete with the Venetian and Genoese maritime republics. The legacy of the 1493 exodus was thus not a simple disappearance, but a widespread institutional dispersal that ensured the survival of Sicilian Jewish administrative and industrial culture within the more expansive and pragmatic framework of the Ottoman Empire. This relocation marked the final chapter of the Sicilian era, as the community was absorbed into the broader Sephardic identity of the early modern Levant. The departure of the Jewish population in early 1493 resulted in the immediate reclassification of thousands of urban properties as bona vacantia, or vacant goods, which were legally absorbed into the royal domain of the House of Aragon. This mass confiscation was administered by the Conservatori di Beni di Ebrei, whose primary function shifted from overseeing the liquidation of movable assets to the permanent reallocation of real estate. In cities like Palermo and Syracuse, entire blocks of the former Judecas were seized and subsequently granted to high-ranking Spanish officials, military commanders, and members of the Sicilian nobility as royal favors. These grants typically included the Jews Expelled, the right to collect rents and tithes from the now vacant dwellings, although the sudden surplus of housing led to a prolonged depression in urban property values. The transition was marked by a series of royal decrees that formally extinguished the communal charters of the algemas, ensuring that no legal vestige of the Jewish corporate identity remained on the island. The industrial landscape of the Sicilian cities underwent a rapid and irreversible contraction as the technical knowledge required for specialized manufacturing vanished with the exiles. The Tintoria monopoly, which had provided the crown with a consistent stream of revenue through the Guzetta tax, fell into total disrepair because the Christian artisans who attempted to occupy the vacant workshops lacked the chemical proficiency for high-grade textile coloration. Administrative reports from the late 15th century note that the silk looms of Messina and the leather tanneries of Trapani were largely abandoned, as the new Christian owners prioritized short-term asset recovery over the maintenance of complex industrial cycles. This loss of technical expertise resulted in the Sicilian economy regressing toward a reliance on the export of raw materials, primarily grain and wool, effectively ending the island's status as a center for high-value Mediterranean finished goods. Fiscal records of the Regia Secretia from 1493 and 1494 reveal a definitive collapse in the collection of indirect urban taxes as the marketplaces of the former Jewish quarters stood empty. The loss of the Jewish mercantile class decimated the municipal credit markets, making it increasingly difficult for the crown to raise emergency donativi through individual advances. To compensate for this shortfall, the vice-regal administration intensified the annona levies on the Christian populace, a move that sparked localized social friction as the promised spiritual purification of the realm was followed by a tangible economic decline. The financial void left by the expulsion also allowed Genoese and Pisan bankers to expand their influence over the Sicilian treasury, as the local sources of liquid capital had been thoroughly liquidated or exported. The physical transformation of the Judecas was completed through the consecration of space, a process whereby the communal infrastructure of the Jewish quarters was repurposed for Catholic use. Synagogues were systematically transferred to the bishoprics and transformed into churches, often receiving names that explicitly commemorated the victory over the Jewish presence. The ritual purification of these buildings involved the removal of all Hebrew inscriptions and the installation of altarpieces, a visual erasure that signaled the absolute nature of the 1492 mandate. By the turn of the 16th century, the silent Judecas had been integrated into the standard parochial map of the Sicilian cities, leaving only the physical shell of the former algemas as a silent testament to the millennial presence that had been excised by royal decree. The definitive execution of the 1492 expulsion mandate by January 1493 marked the structural termination of the medieval Sicilian political compromise, signaling the end of the island's role as a Mediterranean middle ground. This legislative finality removed approximately 5% of the total population, yet the impact was disproportionately concentrated within the urban centers, where the Jewish minority had comprised nearly one-third of the specialized labor force. The departure effectively decapitated the domestic manufacturing sector, as the hereditary transmission of technical skills in metallurgy, coral refining, and advanced sericulture was severed. Consequently, the Sicilian state underwent a profound economic simplification, transitioning from a diversified industrial economy into a peripheral agrarian exporter, focused primarily on the bulk production of cereals for the Spanish imperial military. The disappearance of the Jewish aljama as a corporate legal entity facilitated a massive centralization of credit in the hands of foreign merchant bankers, primarily from Genoa and the Low Countries. These external financiers occupied the void left by the local Jewish magnates, but unlike their predecessors, they did not reinvest their profits into Sicilian urban infrastructure, instead siphoning liquid capital back to the continental mainland. This outward flow of wealth was compounded by the permanent loss of the Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew linguistic bridge, which had historically permitted Sicilian traders to operate with low transaction costs across the Islamic Maghreb and the Levant. By the mid-16th century, the island's maritime reach had contracted significantly as the indigenous networks that had sustained the Geniza-era trade were replaced by the rigid, monopolistic structures of the Spanish Atlantic system. The finality of the mandate also introduced a period of long-term fiscal stagnation for the royal treasury. While the initial seizure of Jewish assets provided a temporary influx of gold to the crown, the permanent loss of the annual subsidies and the specialized industrial excise duties created a structural deficit that the viceregal administration struggled to mitigate. To maintain the defensive fortifications of the frontier of Christendom, the state was forced to impose increasingly regressive consumption taxes on the Christian peasantry, leading to a century of rural unrest and the expansion of the unproductive latifundia system. This shift reinforced the power of the high nobility at the expense of the urban middle class, effectively reversing the centralizing administrative gains achieved during the Hohenstaufen and Aragonese eras. Ultimately, the 1492 decree achieved the Catholic monarch's goal of absolute demographic homogeneity at the cost of the island's systemic commercial vitality. The spiritual hygiene of the realm was purchased through the destruction of a millenarian social fabric that had survived the transitions between Greek, Islamic, and Latin rule. The expulsion was not merely a demographic event, but an institutional amputation that removed the most technically proficient and taxable segment of the population. By the early 16th century, the Judecas had transitioned from vibrant industrial hubs to repurposed parochial zones, marking the definitive closure of Sicily's chapter as a crossroads of Mediterranean civilizations. The island entered the early modern period not as a sovereign intellectual and commercial center, but as a culturally homogenized and economically isolated outpost of the Spanish Habsburgs.